Hello, today I want to talk about moving from reflective practice to action research. And the issues I want to talk about are why I think teachers should do research, what is meant by teacher research, and what kind of questions about learner autonomy teachers can research. Then, when we are doing research, we need to collect data, so we'll have a brief look at the data collection strategies that teachers can use to explore their questions. And then I'll end with some ideas about collaborative action research. So why should teachers do research? Well, firstly, as we know, and not everybody knows, that classrooms are very complex social situations. There's no simple answer to any of the problems that we face in the course of our teaching. After all, we're teaching possibly 30 to 50 people, more perhaps, in a day. We have to make many decisions and we have to keep on our feet most of the time, so no wonder we're tired. It's important, therefore, that research should be done in real classrooms. A lot of research in our field has been done in sort of experimental conditions, in other words, outside a real classroom with its complex, messy reality. Now, because teachers understand this complexity, then they are useful knowledge makers in the field. Too often, teachers are regarded as merely the consumers of other people's ideas, theories, and methods. And teachers who undertake research in their classrooms can become knowledge makers, and this can empower them professionally and academically. So that is why I think teachers should carry out research. But perhaps we need to understand a little bit more about the nature of teacher research. Teacher research begins with systematic reflective practice. As you probably know, reflective practice allows teachers to better understand what they do. Reflective practice reveals teaching that is good, ideas that are good, and those that are not. And those that perhaps cause the teacher problem may, in fact, be worth investigating these in more depth. So teacher research can have two motivations: taking action for understanding what's going on, which we call exploratory research, or taking action to change what's happening in the classroom, which is action research. And this presentation focuses on action research, but as you'll find out, in doing action research, you are also doing exploratory research. The difference is that action research tries to solve a problem, not merely to understand it. So as I've indicated, action research needs to be preceded by reflective practice. The cycle of systematic reflection in, on, and for action is a necessary first step to action research. After reflecting on his or her practice, a teacher may find important issues to explore or practical problems to solve. Conducting action research allows teachers to improve their practice and also to empower them as valuable educational knowledge makers. This is especially true if they do this collaboratively with other teachers. Now, before we continue looking at this, there's a task I'd like you to do. Now, there are many questions that teachers are asking themselves, and some may be considered as research and some may not. So I'd like you to look at the scenarios on the handout and decide which of them are definitely research, possibly research, and definitely not research. Okay, so now we need to look at what is action research. Action research is like any other research because it addresses specific research questions, it systematically collects data and analyses the data, it takes account of ethical issues, that is to say, there are some things that we need to get informed consent from those we are researching and make sure that no harm comes to them, either in what we do or what happens afterwards. And research, action research, like all research, needs to be published. The findings need to be disseminated to an audience. I'll talk about that a bit later. But action research is unlike other research in 2 or 3 important respects. Firstly, action research seeks to understand and then solve practical classroom problems. I say classroom problems, but they could be problems outside the classroom that the teacher can investigate. And this research is done by intervening, by taking action in a specific and natural context. Action research is carried out by practitioners, teachers, not necessarily researchers or academics. Of course, in a number of cases, there can be collaborative research between teachers and academics, but essentially it's carried out by the practitioners themselves. And the aim of this research is to improve practice and also to add new knowledge to our field. For many years, action research has been considered by some people to be not real research. Some academics and others argue that action research is not theoretical enough, that it lacks standard and well-prepared measures of reliability and validity. You can't generalize from action research. And that's obvious because you're looking at a specific context. And as you know, and we know, all teaching contexts are very different. The person in the room next to you is teaching very differently from you, to a different set of people. And also, action research is necessarily subjective and partial. Subjective because you are carrying out the research in your own context, so it's very subjective. It's also partial in the sense that nobody can have a complete view of teaching and learning contexts. So there are those criticisms that people make, and they need to be addressed, but I don't think that they invalidate action research. There are also some other points that people say that most teachers are not trained to do research, and this perhaps is true. Also, and again I hardly need to tell you this, teachers are very busy. And if you're teaching anything like 18 to 24 hours a week, this doesn't give you much time to do any research. However, as the experts in this area say, action research can provide a process of learning from experience, experiential learning. And action research should be both systematic and methodologically rigorous. That's very important. If your research methods are careless or unplanned, unsystematically carried out, you cannot consider it to be research. Action research, then, should be a constant state of revision involving spirals of planning action, monitoring and reflection, and then planning again. So what we see in action research is a series of spirals, each of which is composed of a circle of planning, action, and fact-finding about the result of the action. So I'd like to spend a few minutes thinking about the design of an action research project. And there are several steps to follow, generally speaking. Firstly, there's the identification of a classroom problem to solve or an issue to explore. And then you reflect on previous action that you've done in order to formulate good research questions, one or more questions that you intend to investigate. The next step is to reflect for action. In other words, you plan what you're going to do to understand the issue or to plan the improvement in the problem. You take action, step 4, by collecting data. Step 5, you analyse the data. And step 6, you reflect on what you've done. And then you repeat the process, because those were the spirals I talked about just now. And again, the important thing is to disseminate the findings of what you've investigated. So, step 1, what is the problem? Which problem to solve or to choose? Referring to your reflective journal will help you, as well thinking about your own values, beliefs and ideas, and consulting with your colleagues. Do they have the same issues as you do? If they do have the same issues, then it's worth exploring. If they don't, maybe it's just you. Now, usually you can think of several issues that are worth exploring within any problem. But it's better to narrow the field, to narrow the focus, to ensure that the project is feasible. If you have too many ideas, then you can't collect data to answer all of them. So there are many issues that you can investigate for action research. Just to mention a few of them. How do you integrate language skills? How do you integrate reading and listening? How do you integrate speaking and writing? Focusing on the grammar of language, the language forms. How can you teach grammar better? Understanding what does and doesn't motivate students. Developing particular skills. Promoting group work. Making classrooms more communicative. Trying out new materials, new textbooks, new handouts. Finding new ways to do assessment. Integrating new technology into the classroom. And, as far as we are particularly concerned, increasing learners' autonomy. So the next task I'd like you to do is to think about one or two issues about learner autonomy that you think would be worth investigating. You might want to find out about the opportunities and constraints to learner autonomy in your context posed by the teacher, the learners, and the context in which you're teaching. The second step is to ask the right questions. Assuming the problem is, or the issue is worthy of your time and attention, and it does take time and it does take attention, you need to formulate good research questions, such as, can the data be collected to answer the question in my context? You must tailor your question to your context. If you can't answer the question in your context, then it's not worth taking action. Does the question relate to current discussions in your teaching community, in your school or your university? Or perhaps it's discussed in the professional literature, in journals and magazines. Is the question ethical? As I've mentioned before, the research must not harm the participants in any way, and in a way they must give their consent to be investigated in the way that you choose. And, of course, is the question stated clearly and concisely? Now, the next task I'd like you to do is to consider the issues you raised in the previous task. And I'd like you to write just one research question for each of the issues you looked at. The third step in an action research process is to plan the improvement. So the first thing is to obtain the permission and consent from those involved, You probably need to get your line manager, as we call them in New Zealand, your director of studies or your head of department to give their permission. And you probably need to ask your students if they mind being researched. You need to identify who will be affected by the project and think about who you're going to tell afterwards. It's probably a good idea to look at some relevant background literature. Look at the local journals that you have and see whether the same topic has been discussed by other people. For example, they may have interviewed people, but they may not have observed them teaching. It's a good idea, as I say, to involve others. Certainly to let your colleagues know what you're doing, and hopefully to engage them in a process of collaborative research. So far, so good. Then the next question is, how are you going to collect the data? What data do you need to collect, and how are you going to do it? You need also, at this stage, to think about how you will analyse the data. And then, when you've decided those issues, you need to prepare any equipment and materials you need to carry out the project. So, to look at this question of collaborative action research, some experts, such as Anne Burns, recommend collaborative research when she says applying these spirals in collaborative action research should strengthen the opportunities for the results of research on practice to be fed back into the education systems in a more substantial and critical way. Clearly, by this she means that working together in a team adds strength to the individual researcher. Other experts consider collaboration to be essential in action research. For example, McCutcheon and Jung say, action research is a systematic form of inquiry that is collective, collaborative, self-reflective, critical, and undertaken by participants in the inquiry. So I'd like you to think for a little while about what the benefits are of doing an action research collaboratively. Think about doing collaborative action research in your context. Maybe you can make some notes and share your ideas with a partner. I've got a few ideas about some of the advantages of collaborative action research. First of all, the workload can be shared by one or more colleagues. You can avoid a sense of isolation. When you're working on collecting and analysing data, especially analysing data, it can be very isolating to go through the data again and again, which you need to do. Collaborative research creates a community of practice and learning. Everybody's learning from each other. And peer support in collaborative action research can sustain your motivation. There are always times when we get a bit tired and don't want to do it, but if others are working with us, we have a sense of obligation to them as well. And individuals may feel greater responsibility to the group, and the group to the individuals. If you think about it, if you're working collaboratively, data can be collected from more than one classroom to enable you to compare and contrast your findings. And group discussions in the process, in the design and the practice of action research can be more productive by generating new ideas. However, collaborative action research, or collaborative research generally, can also bring some challenges. So I'd like you, again, reflecting on what you wrote about the advantages of action research, perhaps you could write a list of some of the potential problems that may arise in collaborative action research. Maybe people don't always work together, even if they want to. Maybe they don't always work together harmoniously. Maybe difficulties of communication arise, different ideas, people have contrasting ideas. So I'd like you to make a list, a short list perhaps, of potential problems that may arise in collaborative research in your context. And discuss this with a partner and think about how these challenges could be dealt with. So the fourth step, and we come to it at last in action research, is actually taking action by collecting data. Now there are many ways to collect data, and an action researcher can choose among documentary analysis, that's say analysing curriculum documents, questionnaire, quasi-experiment, interviews, think aloud sessions, teachers' narratives, journals or diaries, or students' narratives, journals or diaries, classroom observation, post-lesson discussion, focus groups, quite a number of things to choose from. And in fact, I'll be talking about these in more detail in the next presentation. But just for now, here's a task I'd like you to do. Clearly, choosing the data collection procedure depends on the question you're going to ask, or the issue you want to investigate, or the problem you want to solve. Now, on the handout, you'll find a number of issues that could be addressed, questions, and also you'll find a list of these different approaches to data collection. What I'd like you to do and think about is which is the primary method you would use, the most important method of collecting data that you would use to answer the question, to deal with the issue, and then perhaps a secondary means of collecting data. I think it's a good idea to use at least two methods of collecting data. So perhaps you would just think about those ways of collecting data and the issues and see if you can match them. Now, clearly, when you're taking action, by which I mean collecting the data, you must remember those spirals, that you just don't collect the data once. You need to do it again, and you need to plan, take action, monitor what's going on, reflect on what has happened, and then replan and take action again. If you are trying to solve a problem, it's very unlikely that by just collecting some data and reflecting upon it, you will find the answer to your problem or a greater understanding. Rather, you need to reflect and replan and collect data again. Now, it's also necessary to analyse the data that you're collecting. The first thing to remember is to make sure that you collect, collate, and store the different sources of data. For example, if you are interviewing somebody, you probably need to record the interview with a tape recorder or digital voice recorder, and you may need to transcribe that. So maybe you need to keep a sound file and a transcription. And if you also observe a lesson, you may need to do the same thing. So you need to collate and store the different sources of data systematically. And you need to analyse the data to identify key elements, to make connections between the data sets, to make connections to compare and contrast what people say in an interview with what they do in a classroom, for example. And then to find patterns and categories within the data sets. Now, doing so, it's a question of comparing and contrasting the different sorts of data that you've collected in order to make sense of it. The data can speak to you, but only you, and perhaps if you're working collaboratively, your colleagues, can actually make sense of the data. And by doing that, by analysing the data and making sense of what they tell you, you can identify issues that seem to address your research questions. The sixth step is to reflect in, on, and for action. And again, we come back to this spiral of reflection and action, that you should not wait until you've collected all your data before you begin to analyse it. If you do that, you'll probably find that you should have taken other action. So as you collect the data, you should analyse it before taking the next step. So you collect the data as it's collected, and then when you have collected a data set, for example, a series of interviews or a series of classroom observations or questionnaires, then you can analyse that as a set. And then by doing that, you can plan the next step in the action research process. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is the value of a researcher's diary. This has been suggested by Simon Borg, who's done a lot of research on what teachers believe and what they do. And he suggests that keeping a research journal can remind the researcher of past ideas, events, and feelings to guide subsequent ones. In other words, to put your reflective notes into some sort of order. And it can therefore provide a record of plans and achievements, or lack of achievements. The journal can recount events and procedures which allow a detailed write-up of the study. I think, as I've said, that the research should end up in discussing or disseminating, writing about your findings, about your study with others. And the research journal can be very helpful in this respect. For yourself, it can also comprise an instructive narrative of your professional growth. And finally, it can help, by discussing it with other colleagues, help to spark off further insights to share with them, with friends, with colleagues, with other researchers, or perhaps with your bosses. So we need to think about what really are the benefits, what are the outcomes of action research. Firstly, it solves a problem. If it doesn't solve a problem, it will help you to identify issues that may lead to the problem being solved. Sharing insights with other people in, for example, professional development workshops is always beneficial for the researcher and for other people in the same field. Undertaking action research will lead you to get greater confidence and competence as a practitioner and as a researcher. What I often find when people engage in action research is they start to realise the importance of researching in order to improve teaching, what we call research-informed teaching. Giving presentations at conferences or writing articles for a journal is also a very useful way of gaining both self-esteem and esteem from peers. And as I said at the very beginning, action research, research of any kind, can empower teachers to give them a greater voice in educational matters, to empower them as a knowledge maker. If you'd like to continue the work we've done in these workshops, here are some questions to consider. Would you like to do an individual or a collaborative action research project? If collaborative, with whom would you like to work? How will you identify the issue or topic or the problem that you want to investigate? Do you need to do some reading to help define your focus? It's always a good idea to look at journals and magazines, professional magazines, to see what other people think in other contexts. Remember that every context is unique. How and where do you plan to disseminate your findings? Are you going to a local workshop Is there a national or international conference coming up? And then, what will be your time plan, your schedule for the project, following the steps, more or less as I've suggested. Well, I hope you found that useful, and I'll talk again later about collecting data. Thank you.